The woman, the woman they could not silence. I've just had a message that recording is in progress, so I'll just say hello to everyone and welcome. My name is Kate Moore. I'm presenting this evening on my new book, The Woman They Could Not Silence. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to just do a few housekeeping things to begin with. So I'm going to start in a moment by doing a short reading from the book. I'll then be doing my presentation, and at the end, I will leave time to ask questions. So what I will ask you to do is to please pop them in the Q&A. If people can see where that is, it's normally at the top of your screen on Zoom. If you pop questions in there, even as I'm talking, I won't be able to check them till we get to the Q&A portion, but once we reach that point in the presentation, I will look there and see your questions, and I'll just take them in order to answer them as we go. So please, totally happy to answer anything, so please do put your questions in there. Thanks. Okay, well, without further ado, let's get started. It is my honor to introduce you to the woman they could not silence. Her name was Elizabeth Packard, and I suspect that many of you have never heard her name before, because as often happens to feisty women who stand up for themselves, history has forgotten her and forgotten her legacy. It commemorates instead the men who tried but failed to silence her. Elizabeth is perhaps the most resilient and fearless woman I have ever encountered, a 5'1" Wonder Woman whose sheer spirit will take your breath away. I want you to picture her for a moment. Long, dark brown hair, brown, almond-shaped eyes, and a nose as strong and straight as her principles. Elizabeth's downfall and her salvation came about because of one thing and one thing only. Elizabeth Packard had a mind of her own. Her story starts in June 1860, on the cusp of the American Civil War, and it starts with Elizabeth, a 43-year-old housewife and mother of 6, lying in bed in her marital home. It starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him? That is what happens to Elizabeth Packard. And I want to turn now to do the reading from the book. I am doing a short reading from an edited extract of chapter 1. And before I begin the reading, I just want to make the point that this is a history book I've written. This is a non-fiction book, because as I hope you'll hear as I begin the reading, this is a book that hopefully reads like a novel. As a writer, I'm a storyteller. I want to take readers on a journey. I want you to get swept up in the moment and in the history. And so I write in a way that hopefully the characters come to life and the pages keep turning. There's cliffhanger endings to the chapters. But I want you to remember that this is history. And every line of dialogue in the book, every quotation, it comes from an authentic historical resource, a record made by someone who was present at the time. So let's get started. I do just want to address, because I can see some comments popping up in the chat. I believe some people can't see me. I'm sorry for that. We are having a few technical difficulties, but hopefully you can hear me okay. And I also want to say I won't be able to monitor the chat as I'm presenting. So feel free to talk amongst yourselves, and I will just crack on with this, and I will try and check the chat and definitely check the Q&A at the end to pick up on those questions. So to the reading. We start with chapter 1. The date is June 18th, 1860, and the setting is Manteno, Illinois. It was the last day, but she didn't know it. In truth, we never do, not until it is too late. She woke in a handsome maple bed, body covered by a snow-white counterpane. As her senses resurfaced after a restless night's sleep, Elizabeth Packard's brown eyes blearily mapped the landmarks of her room: embroidered ottoman, mahogany bureau, and smart green shutters that, for some reason, were failing to let in any light. Ordinarily, her husband of 21 years, Theophilus, a preacher, would have been snoring next to her, his gravity-defying curly red hair an impromptu pillow beneath his head. But a few long weeks before, he'd abandoned their marital bed. He thought it best, or so he'd said, to sleep alone these days. Instead, her senses were filled by the precious proximity of her slumbering 6-year-old son. Her children were truly the sun, moon, and stars to Elizabeth. To see their happy faces and laughing eyes offered such blessed light. It was particularly welcome in a world that was becoming, by the day, increasingly black. Such melancholy thoughts were uncharacteristic for Elizabeth. In normal times, the 43-year-old was always rejoicing. But the splits that were even now threatening her country, with some forecasting an all-out civil war, were mirrored in her small domestic sphere within her neat 2-story home. Over the past 4 months, she and her husband had retreated behind those enemy lines, prompting much anxious foreboding from Elizabeth. The Packards had married in 1839, when Elizabeth was a green 22 and Theophilus a dusty 37. At first, all had seemed well. Elizabeth had been raised to be a silent listener, and her preacher husband contentedly became the sole mouthpiece in their marriage. To make him happy was the height of my ambition, Elizabeth wrote. That's all I wanted, to make my husband shine inside and out. The problem in their marriage had been, he didn't make her shine in return. Their characters were as opposite as it was possible to get. Where Elizabeth was vibrant, sociable, and curious, Theophilus was gloomy, timorous, and, in his own words, dull. Elizabeth described their marriage as cheerless. Nevertheless, she said nothing to him directly. That is, until everything changed. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, unleashing a national conversation about the rights of women. It was one in which Elizabeth and, less willingly, Theophilus took part. Countless times, the couple had warm discussions on the subject. It was Elizabeth, naturally blessed with a most rare command of language, who triumphed in these fights. Yet her victories came at a cost. She felt the demonstration of her intellect prompted jealousy, lest I outshine him. Theophilus was stung to the quick, and his grievances slowly grew. He was the kind of man who counted them like pennies, recording slights in his diary with the miserly accuracy of a rich man unwilling to share his wealth. He grumbled crossly, "My wife was unfavorably affected by the tone of society, and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along." Perhaps the notion that caused him most consternation? In Elizabeth's words, "I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his." Elizabeth's newfound autonomy was anathema to Theophilus. "Wives, obey your husbands" became a scriptural passage oft quoted in their home. But Elizabeth was no longer silently listening. Defiantly, she kept on articulating her own thoughts, asserting her own self, inspired by the women's rights movement that it was her right to do so. Theophilus's response was telling. He did not allow his wife agency. He did not encourage her independence. Instead, he wrote that he had sad reason to fear his wife's mind was getting out of order. She was becoming insane on the subject of women's rights. On the morning of June 18th, 1860, Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in bed, her disquiet slowly intensifying. Over the past 4 months, Theophilus had made it plain he wanted her gone. He could not cope with his newly outspoken wife, with her independent mind and her independent spirit, not least because Elizabeth did not keep her new character confined to their home. She asserted herself in public too. In the face of her impassioned eloquence, Theophilus felt powerless and furiously impotent. He conceived a plan. He kept it simple. Just 7 words intended to silence her once and for all. When the Packards next argued, he warned Elizabeth, if she did not conform, I shall put you into the asylum. Now you might have thought, as Elizabeth Packard did, well, what a ridiculous thing to say. Of course he can't send her away to an asylum because she's an assertive woman. Of course he can't send her away just for standing up to him. But there you, like Elizabeth, would be wrong. Because as crazy as it seems to us today, in Elizabeth's time, actually women were regularly committed for acts of self-assertion, even for simply reading novels. The theory ran that women who had ungovernable personalities, women who had strong resolution, plenty of what is termed nerve, were actually textbook examples of female insanity. And those quotations come from psychiatrists of the era. They believed that women who were assertive or ambitious, who wanted to be more than mothers and wives, were insane. The official diagnosis was something called moral insanity. The definition is eccentricity of conduct. But of course, eccentricity of conduct, like beauty, is all in the eye of the beholder. In the 19th century, there were biological-based gender roles, home and children for women and work and intellect for men. And any woman who wanted more than that domestic sphere was seen as unfeminine, therefore unnatural, therefore diseased and mentally ill. And there were actually 2 strikes against Elizabeth, because not only was she assertive, not only did she strive to have a voice outside the home, she was also an educated woman. And in the 19th century, women who studied or read were seen at increased risk of going mad. As I began my research for The Woman They Could Not Silence, I dug out the records of the Illinois State Hospital. Very helpfully, they published biennial reports, and in these reports were listed the causes of insanity in the patients who'd been committed to the hospital. There, in black and white, in these historical records, was the cause of insanity that should make us all shudder, given we're here at a library event. The cause was novel reading. I found another case note of a young woman, a 15-year-old girl known only as B. She was committed to an asylum in May 1860, just a few months before Elizabeth is waking up on that June morning. And B was committed because she'd become greatly addicted to novel reading. The theory ran that women who used their brains meant that they were at increased risk of becoming ill. A doctor visiting an all-girls high school in 1858 remarked to its teachers, "You are training your girls for the insane asylum." Dr. Andrew McFarland, who is the doctor to whom Theophilus Packard applies to send his wife. McFarland was the superintendent of the Illinois State Hospital. Well, McFarland explained this theory and this diagnosis. He said that when minds of limited capacity to comprehend subjects tried to do so, it ultimately led to mental breakdown. That's why Elizabeth, an educated woman who was described as having a fine mind and a brilliant imagination, was seen as susceptible to madness. Now, to Elizabeth's horror, it wasn't only the doctors of the era who thought this way. As Theophilus Packard viewed his wife's new independence with suspicion, he began to say to his parishioners that he thought his wife was mad. and they therefore began to view her actions through this prism of madness. And when you look at what his parishioners thought, they encouraged their pastor to send her away. Now, that was partly because as Elizabeth grew in confidence and grew in her sort of sense of self and her belief in her own faith, she decided she didn't want to worship at her husband's church anymore. She left to go and worship with the Methodists down the road. And of course, for Theophilus, this was such a rejection of his authority, both marital and spiritual, that he had to take action. And so he galvanized his parishioners and they signed a petition to have Elizabeth committed. But when you look at what they thought of as mad behavior, I think you'll be shocked. For example, one person said that they'd seen Elizabeth shouting at her husband because he had not cleaned the yard. Now, I'm sure many of us have shouted at our husbands because they have not done something. But in Elizabeth's case, this anger and this rage was seen as madness. And that is very true, actually, throughout history, that angry women are seen as irrational and mad. Another parishioner said that Elizabeth had confided her dislike for her husband. Well, once again, this is acting out of that prescribed domestic sphere. Women are supposed to be placid and timid, to absorb the male gaze, to be delighted by male attention. And a woman who dislikes her husband, well, again, that's seen as incredibly unnatural and therefore sick. The third thing that really struck me about what the parishioners said about Elizabeth was that they cited her incessant talking as evidence of madness. And I want to mention here a much more modern, recent social study that was conducted. It found that when women were seen to be dominating a conversation, actually, women were only talking for about 30% of the time. A woman was not held by the same standard as men. People weren't actually assessing accurately how much she was talking. They were looking at a woman who had a voice and comparing her to the ideal of a silent woman. And therefore, any woman who spoke at all was deemed to be talking too much. And so it was for Elizabeth too. With his parishioners standing behind him, Theophilus Packard committed his wife to the asylum. And on a hot summer's night in June 1860, Elizabeth climbed the stone steps of the Illinois State Hospital and the door slammed shut behind her. Elizabeth Packard was not too worried to begin with. She thought it would be fine. She was clearly a sane woman. If the doctors wouldn't release her, then she would appeal to the law for salvation. But here Elizabeth was in for another shock, because the law, too, was on her husband's side. The law said the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. It was a law known as coverture. It had been first written in the 1100s, and it had been inherited from England. It seems we Brits have a lot to answer for. It meant that married women had no civic rights at all. They had no legal identity. They had been subsumed within that of their husbands. Married women therefore had no right to their own earnings, no right to the custody of their children, no right even to their very liberty. The law in Illinois at that time, it's there in the statute books, it said married women could be committed to asylums by the request of their husbands alone, and specifically without the evidence of insanity that was required in other cases. So Elizabeth had no recourse to freedom whatsoever. All the odds were stacked against her. And as she entered the 7th ward in the Illinois State Hospital and met her fellow inmates, she realized very quickly she was not the only one that this had happened to. The wards were overcrowded, stuffed full of other women who had been sent there by domineering husbands or fathers. The doctors themselves said that they admitted patients who had caused the greatest annoyances to their family, women who defied all domestic control. And these were the women, the sisters, that Elizabeth found in the hospital. The overcrowding was such that McFarland had recently had to apply for funding to expand his hospital. It had been granted, and a new wing had just been built that would have space to commit another 150 patients. Every single one of them would be a woman. And that brings to light another truth about 19th century psychiatry. Actually, the received medical wisdom of the age said that simply being a woman meant you were at risk of going mad. Doctors believed that women's sexual organs caused madness. Women's menstrual cycles were seen as particularly problematic. And so, incredibly, mothers were actually encouraged to try to delay their daughters' periods. The advice that doctors gave them was that these young women should avoid reading novels, feather beds, eating red meat. They had to take cold shower baths and to wear drawers. And this supposedly would stave off their menstrual cycles from coming, and therefore also stave off this risk of insanity. What a time Elizabeth Packard lived in. There was almost nothing she could do to combat that stigma of insanity once the finger had been pointed at her. And once locked up in the asylum, as I say, she had no way to have a voice, to speak out, to try and fight for her freedom. But how Elizabeth Packard responded to that situation was truly remarkable, because Elizabeth's journey and the journey of the book is how she becomes the woman they could not silence. It's about a woman's journey to find her unsilenceable voice. Elizabeth herself wrote that when she was committed to the asylum, she wrote, "The worst that my enemies can do, they have done, and I fear them no more. I am now free to be true and honest. No opposition can overcome me." And so Elizabeth actually becomes a stronger woman, even though the treatment at the time was that it was a kind of subduing treatment. That's what Elizabeth called it. Dr. Andrew McFarland wrote that he saw the dynamic between doctors and patients as one of Prospero with his Caliban. He wrote that he was the women's superior. He wanted to teach them how to submit to masculine authority. He wanted them to become elevated by his smile and to bow at his reproof. Elizabeth called it a subduing treatment, and she said that she'd been sent to the asylum to be broken in. But she defied this treatment. She wrote, "In my case, this woman-crushing machinery works the wrong way. The true woman shines brighter and brighter under the process instead of being strangled." And as the book charts, Elizabeth does find her voice. She finds that strength through the crucible of suffering. I heard this quote the other day that said, "You can't go to hell and not come back empty-handed." And so Elizabeth does not come back empty-handed. She finds a voice, and she finds a way actually to become even truer to herself. She finds a way to fight for others. She becomes a writer. She was actually forbidden to write because even having that voice on paper was deemed too transgressive and too dangerous. And so she steals scraps of fabric. She rips out the margins in newspapers, and through these tiny bits of paper and fabric, she writes a secret journal, a journal that charts what it is truly like to be a sane woman in an insane asylum. And that journal has survived, and I've been able to draw on it in my book. And it tells us, the whole book tells us about Elizabeth's journey, a journey that takes her from housewife to historically significant heroine. And I won't spoil the story, but suffice it to say that Elizabeth is a force to be reckoned with, not only within the asylum where she fights for her sisters, she fights against abuse, she fights against cruelty, she fights for the patients to not be pathologized simply for having their own personalities. She actually makes her mark beyond the asylum too, including in the law books, a law change that still resonates right through to today. Make no mistake, though this is a history book and it's about a historical heroine, the issues at its heart could not be more modern. And that's actually how I came to this story. The story didn't start for me in the June of 1860. It started in the fall of 2017, when the fire of the Me Too movement was blazing all around us. I was inspired by that movement, women speaking out and speaking up against misogyny, sexual harassment, rape. What really struck me about the movement, though, was not that women were speaking up, because to be honest, we always have. It was that finally we were being listened to and believed. And it made me think, well, why has it taken so long, and how have women been silenced in the past? And as I sat at my kitchen table in London thinking about these ideas, all my thoughts coalesced around a single realization. For centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. And that still happens today. Just last summer, the woman who is now Vice President, Kamala Harris, she was called a mad woman because of the assertive way that she conducted herself in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi, very famously, you might remember that scene of her standing up to Donald Trump and a whole table of male politicians, one woman standing tall in an electric blue suit. Well, Trump tweeted after that confrontation with Pelosi, there is something wrong with her upstairs. She is a very sick person. Even just this week, we've seen Britney Spears, another supposedly mad woman trying to get out from beneath the legal shackles of masculine authority. And in her testimony, she described that any time she asserted herself, she would be punished psychiatrically. So this was the issue that I wanted to write about. But I didn't want to write a polemic because, as anyone who's read the Radium Girls will know, I am a storyteller. That's what I think I do best. It's what I love about reading and writing. I want to take readers on that journey and have them swept up in the story. So I didn't want to write an overtly political book. What I wanted to do was to try to find one woman's story in history that would allow me to explore these ideas and sort of hold a mirror up to society and make readers realize the parallels even in our modern age. But I hope that they would fall in love with Elizabeth as I did and be taken on that journey. So even if you don't take the political message away, I hope it's still just a really good yarn and a really good story that people will enjoy almost as a novel. And so I went looking for that woman, the woman I hope to find. I had no idea whether she even existed. But on the 15th of January 2018, I fell down this rabbit warren of internet searches about women and madness. And in a University of Wisconsin essay that I randomly found online, 4 pages in was a single reference to a woman called Elizabeth Packard. I started digging into her story, and very quickly I realized she was the woman I wanted to write about next. Because what a woman she is. Just think about her situation, a sane woman locked up in an asylum. Think about how she responds. She finds her voice. Think about everything she is battling against: her husband's authority, the received medical wisdom of the age, the entire patriarchy. And yet she triumphs. She is an extraordinary person, truly brilliant, brilliant woman. She's actually described as having an irresistible magnetism. And simply from the way that even her enemies talk about her, you can tell that she was a truly special person. And also, as I researched her, I realized what a story she has. Because this is a story that is about an empowering fight for justice. It's a story that stars a compelling heroine. It's got courtroom drama. It has a twist of Gothic horror as I take you inside the insane asylums of the 19th century. And perhaps above all else, as I say, this is the journey, the story of a woman finding her voice and using it to make the world a better place. What could be more inspiring than that? As I started my research, however, I realized I was going to be up against it because there is no Elizabeth Packard special collection where you can research. There are no memorials to Elizabeth, but there is a mental health center in Springfield, Illinois, that is named after Dr. Andrew McFarland, the doctor who kept Elizabeth incarcerated in the Illinois State Hospital. What I did find, however, were Elizabeth's own books. That voice that she had found, she used and she published. No publisher officially would touch her. And so Elizabeth remarkably crowd-funded her books. She convinced thousands of people to invest 50 cents in her, and she used that capital to print her own books. In that way, she rose above the stigma of insanity, which was why the publishers wouldn't touch it. And she was able to leave her voice behind. The books are extraordinary. She's a really talented writer, and I've been able to quote them throughout the book so that you will hear from Elizabeth herself in her own words what she was really thinking and feeling at every step of her journey. The other aspects of my research were that I wanted to present a balanced view. I didn't just want to take Elizabeth's version of events as read. To my delight, I was able to find her husband's diary. So you've got his version of events in there too. I have to say, I can see why Elizabeth argued with him and had problems with him. He's such a dull man, and the summer I read his diary is a summer I will never get back. As well as the husband, I was also able to draw on Dr. Andrew McFarland's notes and writings, and they were illuminating too. He wrote that it was Elizabeth's hatred of her husband that for him was the nail in the coffin. This is why he thought she was mad. Apparently, it had something diabolical about it. My research into the doctors' accounts of the time, into medical journals of the era, perhaps unearthed the most shocking facts that I uncovered for this book. I spoke earlier about how simply having a female body was considered at the time as a risky business for going mad. Now, because of that belief, doctors actually focused their treatments of the era on women's sexual organs too. And perhaps the most shocking thing that I read about in my research was that when women were treated for madness, something that they could be treated by was a surgical operation called a clitoridectomy, or what we might today call female genital mutilation. They would cut off women's clitorises. And the case notes that I read, the patients on whom this operation was carried out, included a 20-year-old woman whose only so-called symptom of madness was that she liked to engage in serious reading. Another patient was a 30-year-old wife who had simply expressed dislike for the society of her husband. You might think that this horrible treatment is confined to the history books to 160 years ago, the mid-19th century, but you'd be wrong, because actually my research showed that in the Western world, clitoridectomies to correct emotional disorder were actually carried out right up until the 1940s. The last recorded case was on a 5-year-old girl. The more I read about this subject, the more passionate I became. And the final part of my research that I just want to talk to you about this evening was my research trip in America to research the book, following in Elizabeth Packard's own footsteps. I traveled to her marital hometown of Shelburne, Massachusetts, which is way up in the mountains. It's a tiny hamlet on a mountainside, essentially, a landscape that is full of hills and trees, a landscape that speaks deafeningly of what has always been and always will be. And I found it incredibly insightful to then travel, as Elizabeth did, west, to come to Illinois and to be in those wonderful wide prairies that you have and to be beneath those wide open skies. Because just think about what a physical difference that is to move from that old landscape into a place where the possibilities seem endless. Elizabeth's own mind opened like those Illinois skies. And actually, I think that journey was really integral in her own development as an assertive woman who knew her own mind and had this unsilenceable voice. When I was in Illinois, I did travel to Manteno, and I went to worship at the church where Theophilus had preached. It's a small whitewashed church, and as you sit in the simple room, you sit beneath these beamed ceilings. And again, it was really instructive to me to sit and worship there, because as I stood and sat with the congregation, as our voices rose and fell in unison as we sang and prayed, I realized what it was for Elizabeth to break away from that cohesion, that sense of community. To strike out on her own was even more remarkable when you think about what it would entail. As a coda, the church now has a female pastor. And I just thought that was just such a brilliant coda for the end of this story. What an epilogue that is, that a church that had tried to silence a woman is now led by a woman themselves. The final part of my research trip took me to Jacksonville in Illinois, which is where the Illinois State Hospital was based. Like Elizabeth, I crossed past the stone gateposts that mark the borders of the asylum grounds. Of course, they're very old now. The stone is crumbling, but they are still twice the height of a woman. And there is a very real sense of crossing over as you move from the noise and roar of civilization into the quiet grounds of what is now a community park. The buildings there are abandoned, and I interviewed locals who told me that they used to break in as teenagers in their misspent youth. They would traverse the long corridors of the hospital by flashlight, seeking out the secrets of the insane asylum. As I walked among them, it was quite an eerie place to go to, because there are these abandoned bandstands and the trees themselves seem to have voices. The trees are the trees that Elizabeth described in her writings, this infant orchard in her time, trees now grown to maturity and so many and so verdant that when the wind whistles through them, it truly sounds like a chorus of voices speaking to you. To my disappointment, the hospital building in which Elizabeth had been held was demolished in 1984, so I was 30 years too late to actually go inside myself. When they knocked the building down, they kept the limestone windowsills because over the centuries, the patients had etched words and pictures into them, trying to be heard. And the site does still have voices trying to be heard. Even after the hospital building was knocked down, in 1988, they discovered a tranche of unmarked graves because the patients were always buried without any kind of marker. On my research trip, I peered through the windows of the abandoned auxiliary buildings that did still stand. Even that was haunting, to see the way that the paint was unfurling from the underside of the staircases, looking like underwater seaweed or a drowning woman's hair. I glimpsed orphan furniture, a desk, a chair, a hat stand with no hats. The buildings were graffitied, "Don't open, dead inside." But I think it is important to open the doors to the past, because through them step people like Elizabeth Packard, with her spirit as wide as her cage crinoline skirt and her voice as unsilenced through the centuries as it was when she herself lived. Elizabeth wrote, "Women are made to fly and soar, not to creep and crawl as the haters of our sex want us to." And I think the greatest of all Elizabeth's many legacies is this. Through her story, she teaches us all how to fly. She teaches us all that if we believe in ourselves and in our voices, we can use them to make the world a better place. She teaches us to have faith in ourselves, no matter what anyone says to us, no matter what words or allegations people hurl at us. She says, be true to yourself and be strong. She wrote, "I will not hide my light under a bushel. I will set it upon a candlestick, that it may give light to others." And to all our benefit, Elizabeth Packard's light still shines, and you can read all about it in The Woman They Could Not Silence. I hope your lives will be lit by her light, just as mine has been. Thank you. At this stage, Donna is going to test a microphone. So let's see how she gets on. Oh, I can hear things.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Donna.
Can the audience hear me? How about somebody? Yay. Okay. Yes. Excellent. Okay. Well, a little bit late to the party, but welcome, Kate. And thank you so much. What a fabulous presentation. I read the book cover to cover, and at times I was infuriated. Sometimes I was horrified, and other times I felt so that it was so redeeming to read it. So thank you for all that you've done today to share the story of Elizabeth Packard with us, and for writing the book. It is truly an amazing read.
Thank you so much.
As was the Radium Girls, which I also thought was fabulous. We have a lot to cover in the chat, and some in the Q&As. It's both places, many compliments. I'm going to go to the Q&A first. Here's one. Were there any differences between religious denominations of their view of women?
Yes, there were. Yes, there were. And at the time we're talking about, most religious denominations did sort of preach that women should, if not obey their husbands, think of them as a marital authority. Actually, the religion, as it was deemed at that time, of spiritualism, was deemed the most equal of religions. About approximately 10 million people followed spiritualism at that time. They thought at the time it was going to be the next sort of big major religion across America. And that had a very egalitarian approach, partly because a lot of mediums were women, literally using their voices to communicate. But most of the other denominations frowned upon women, partly because people feared the rise of spiritualism, also the rise of women sort of becoming a conduit to the spirits. A lot of the more traditional religions wanted to keep male preachers as the conduit to God that the congregation would follow. And so they were very sort of leery about women's rights and, anyone testing those boundaries, because they thought it undermined the authority of the church. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that, who is a very famous women's rights campaigner. She led the national campaign for women's rights in America. And she wrote that actually, the politicians would respond to their sort of aspired reforms. They might shoot them down, but they would do so in a sort of quite measured way. But she said that religious leaders would sort of sizzle like, peas in a hot skillet, because they were, so outraged by women trying to have more of a voice. So that's my understanding of the religious history of the time and women.
Wow. Okay. Next question. Are there any descendants of Elizabeth still alive?
Yes, there are, and I did reach out to them, and I know on this call are some families of the Radium Girls who were kind enough to help me with my research for the Radium Girls. And of course, because I'd had such a wonderful experience with those families who were so helpful, one of the first things I did actually was to reach out to Elizabeth's family. I tracked them down in a similar way that I did the Radium Girls families, and reached out to them and said I was writing a book about Elizabeth, and would they help? Now, they were delighted that I was writing the book, but unfortunately, this is not women from the 1920s that we're talking about. There are no sisters, sons, daughters, nieces, nephews left. I'm talking to great-great-granddaughters. So unfortunately, they couldn't really tell me anything more than I was finding in the other historical resources, partly because Elizabeth's story was not passed down through her family. There was a really damaging sort of change in the way that insanity was viewed around the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th centuries. It was deemed to be hereditary and incurable. And so anyone who had any sort of shadow of insanity in their families, and of course Elizabeth was sane, but she had been sent to this asylum, people were ashamed of it. They didn't want to talk about it in case it got passed down to the children. So unfortunately, any anecdotes that might have been, passed down through the history had also been lost, because there was a sort of, choking off of any anecdotes around that period of time. The one thing that I did love about what her great-great-granddaughter told me, however, is that she does still have Elizabeth's original books, the first editions, signed first editions of Elizabeth's books. and she keeps them on her mantelpiece. And she said anytime there's a major family celebration, for example, when her children went to prom, she would take the prom pictures in her living room with the books on display behind the central figures, so that Elizabeth, the matriarch of this family, is present at the family celebrations. And I thought that was wonderful.
What a wonderful story. I so agree. Wow. Someone says, what was it that caused you to write this book? I know you covered that. Is there anything that perhaps we skipped while you were?
No, I don't think so. As I say, inspired by the Me Too movement and lucky enough to find this phenomenal woman who, you know, did even more than I could expect. You know, I couldn't have expected to find such a brilliant writer in my subject. I couldn't have expected to find such a wonderfully dramatic story with all the twists and turns and the gothic horror and the courtroom drama. You know, it's, as I say, I hope even beyond the political message that I think is in the book, and it's not an overt sort of bang you over the head political message. I think it just makes, you know, as the Radium Girls did with its message about corporations putting profit before people and how that still happens today. You know, you see that through the history, and it's similar with Elizabeth's story. But even if you're not sort of thinking about that or inspired by that or struck by that, it's still just a really good story.
Yes, it is. Karen asks, is there a UK bookshop where she could buy a signed copy of the new book?
Yes, there is a bookshop. The bookshop is Prairie Fox Books, and they have signed copies. So Prairie Fox Books in Ottawa, Illinois, is the place to go, and I thoroughly recommend them, as they're a wonderful bookstore.
And this question, though, I believe is for a UK location. For can Prairie Fox sell to someone in England?
Dylan is the person to ask about that, really. If you are in the UK and you can't get a signed copy from Prairie Fox Books, what I will say is, if you email me, and you can find my details on my website, kate-moore.com, I'm very happy to post you a signed book plate, and you can stick that in your book that you can purchase from, you know, Waterstones or WH Smith or wherever you get your books from, your local indie bookstore. You can, if you buy it separately, I'm very happy to post you a signed book plate if you want to contact me directly. That's kate-moore.com.
Perfect. Okay, Liz asks, or says, I couldn't put your book down. Her relationship with Dr. McFarland was puzzling. Why do you think she trusted him after some of his actions and betrayal?
Well, I think in some ways she didn't have a choice. You're right. The relationship between Elizabeth and McFarland is fascinating, complicated. It was very complex to sort of try and get your head around it, because it does take lots of twists and turns. You know, she likes him, then she hates him, then she's trusting him again. I think two things. One, she didn't really have a choice. If she was going to get out of the asylum, she couldn't just eternally reject him and, you know, turn her back when he walks in the room. She has to engage with him on some level, because he holds her liberty in his hands. And the second thing is, he does eventually permit her liberty to write. And that to Elizabeth is everything, because this is a woman, even before she gets to the asylum, she is in a marriage where her husband does not want her to have a voice. And so, you know, she's never had a voice before. And actually, in many ways, ironically, going to the asylum actually widens Elizabeth's world, because she's able to make friends with all these other women. She ends up leading them in prayer circles. As I say, she finds her voice, she becomes a writer. Actually, spiritually, it's a sort of widening of her horizons. You know, she's able to think for herself freely, because, you know, once she's sent away to the asylum, people think that's it, she's locked up. But actually, as I mentioned in my talk, she's growing stronger and stronger. And when McFarland does eventually relent and he lets her write, that to Elizabeth is everything. And that colors all of her interactions with the man from then on.
Yes, I have a question. Elizabeth's story, like all of ours, is part of our history and the history around us. I was curious about that small point in the book about Cyrus McCormick and
Yeah.
his financial hold on Theophilus and his pro-slavery position, and her and Elizabeth's anti-slavery outspokenness. Can you talk to that point just a bit?
Yes, and actually, I was as a researcher, I was really pleased to stumble on that little nugget of information, because I haven't actually seen anyone who has ever written on Elizabeth before ever sort of make that connection and join the dots. And it was one of those things where, you know, they say if you're investigating, you know, any kind of crime, for example, follow the money. And that's what I did. There was this reference in the churches, in the Mantino churches records, that said they've been gifted this enormous sum of money by the McCormicks that allowed the church to build their first permanent home. And at the same time, the church switched its creed. It moved from being New School Presbyterian Church to Old School Presbyterian Church. And the key difference at that time was that New School was pro-abolition, but Old School was ambivalent about it. They were sitting firmly on the fence. They wouldn't protest against what I consider, you know, the utter inhumanity of slavery. They wouldn't speak out against it. They, you know, maintained the status quo. And that's obviously quite an extraordinary thing to do. And, you know, the reason behind it is that McCormick, who's this extraordinarily wealthy man, probably the richest man in America at the time, he didn't want there to be a civil war. So he launched this campaign to install, you know, either pro-slavery pastors or people who were ambivalent about it, rather than having pro-abolition principles preached from the pulpit, because he believed strongly, you know, it's about the battle for hearts and minds, isn't it? And if you haven't got a preacher standing up there leading your community to be against slavery, then he was hoping that, you know, all of that feeling that was stirring up the Civil War would eventually dissipate and go away, and there wouldn't be a war. So he poured an enormous amount of money into that campaign, and Theophilus's church was one of them. What I find, you know, that is partly to do with Elizabeth striking away from her husband, because she is pro-abolition, and as she's finding her voice, and Theophilus is towing this official line of not, you know, not speaking out against slavery, she finds this abhorrent. She lectures him and says, you know, you need to tell people that it's wrong. And when Theophilus doesn't, she eventually leaves the church. The thing that I found so cowardly about Theophilus is Theophilus actually supported abolition. You know, in former times, when he couldn't make one of his sermons one week, he hired an African-American to preach for him. You know, he was actually pro-abolition himself, but he didn't have the courage of his convictions. You know, he took the money and he changed his principles. He wouldn't speak out against what is clearly an inhumane and wrong practice. And that, I think, just sums up the kind of cowardly man that he was. And it illustrates how, you know, strong Elizabeth was in contrast.
Another question for you. How did the Jacksonville State Hospital compare with other institutions of the time?
I think it was fairly comparable to other American institutions of the time. One thing I did read in the research is that McFarland spent the least amount of money of all institutions nationwide. So, you know, he actually boasts of the monastic plainness of his asylum. You know, there aren't nice furnishings for the patients. The one time he's criticized by his trustees is that, you know, essentially for his penny pinching, it is to the detriment of the patient's comfort. So it's a pretty typical institution, but it was sort of cheaper than most in the sense of he wanted to be financially astute, so he didn't spend money on the patient's comfort in any stretch of the imagination at all. And I think that was probably the key difference from all the other institutions. If you see it listed in a chart, Illinois State Hospital was right at the bottom in terms of what he spent on the patients.
Okay. Marlene was responding to your response to Liz's question earlier. She says, perhaps writing was the primary reason that Elizabeth could maintain her sanity throughout all of her incarceration.
I think it totally was. I think it totally was. And we see that throughout history, actually, people who are incarcerated who are able to write do usually maintain their sanity, because it's just something to keep you tethered, isn't it? To yourself and to your story.
Yes. Did Elizabeth's tenacity and intellect affect the future adult lives of her children? Certainly, Libby's tragic life was a result of Elizabeth's imprisonment. Can you talk about what happened with the boys, if you feel that they benefited by Elizabeth's?
Yeah, I think what happens to her children, so she had 6 children. They range in age at the start of the book from 18 years to 18 months. And that for me was, another shocking part of the story. She's literally just stopped breastfeeding her baby. And, just a month or so later, she's taken away to the asylum. Her baby's only 18 months old and she's robbed from him. Awful. That child, incidentally, grows up. The family described him as a sort of unimpressive sort of man. He's the child over whom Elizabeth has least influence. And I think that's quite telling, that was the kind of man, that baby, who didn't have the benefits of her mothering. That's what he turned out to be. The child who was most influenced by Elizabeth was Samuel Packard, and he in himself became a notable historical figure, particularly in Illinois, because he was a Chicago lawyer. He was integral. I think his key case was something working on the Dakotas, some complicated financial thing as they were becoming states and that sort of thing. So there was a key historical case that Samuel was involved in. And like his mother, he aspired to, fight for justice and to sort of get his teeth into a case and persist until he got his own way. And he certainly learned that from his mother.
Yes, I could see that. We've had several questions about what you will be working on next. So why don't you share a little bit of secrets with us?
Well, to be honest, I don't know yet. I'm swiftly coming to the point where I'm going to have to make a decision. I've got a few ideas, but at this stage, I don't even know if one of those ideas is going to be the idea or if I'm going to stumble on something else. So I don't know yet, is the honest answer. But there will be something coming, probably in a few years' time, because as I say, I haven't even thought yet what it's going to be.
With 4 years of research, no doubt that will go into it.
Exactly.
Well, Kate, this has been delightful despite the microphone.
I'm so sorry, so frustrating. But hopefully I did an all right job at getting everything kicking off.
Absolutely, you did. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience and their patience with this. We were so delighted to have this opportunity to have you here today. I didn't get the chance to say it at the beginning, so I want to thank the Reddick Public Library District for joining us in bringing you to this audience, and to Prairie Fox Books, who has been doing their absolute best to get your books out to as many people as possible. As quickly as possible. Of course, both libraries have the books, but if you want to have your own copy of this new book, The Woman That Could Not Be Silent, They Could Not Silence, and the Radium Girls, please talk to Prairie Fox Books. They're ready for you. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Kate, for final comments.
Brilliant. Well, I want to say how excited I was to do this event. Obviously, Ottawa, Illinois is such a special place in my heart, and LaSalle is just down the road. Pearl Payne actually lived in LaSalle for a while, so it does have a connection to the Radium Girls as well. So I want to say thank you to everyone for coming. I know not everyone is from Ottawa. It was actually a great event for my UK readers. So hello to all my British readers as well, if you're here tuning in. And just thank you to the libraries, thank you to Prairie Fox Books, and thank you to everyone for coming. I hope Elizabeth's story inspires you as much as it does me.
Thank you very much, Kate. And we're waiting for the next one.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the support. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Good night.